Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Varun Rai. I'm an associate professor in public affairs and mechanical engineering at UT Austin. I'm also director of the Energy Institute here. I'm just very delighted to be back. I spoke at one of these series 3 years ago that was also on soft costs, and since then we embarked on a multi-year project which is part of the Solar Energy Evolution and Diffusion Studies, or SEEDS 2 program, that is funded by the Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technology Office. This project started in 2017. We are in year 3, so the final year. It's a multi-institutional study, so apart from me, we have Adam Henry from University of Arizona, Doug Hanna, who is in the business school here at UT, Professor Greg Nemeth at University of Wisconsin-Madison, Professor William Rand at NCSU, and then the consulting from Research into Action. I would also like to acknowledge Dr. Ariane Beck, who is the project coordinator and manager, and also Eric Funkhauser, who has been a key part of many of the things that you will see today. So, I don't have to tell this audience that solar soft costs are pretty important. They're also very sticky. They form about 60% of the cost of installed solar, but they have been hard to kind of get a handle on. And looking forward, it's important to kind of focus and try to bring them down to further grow the market and see higher penetration of solar. So the goal of this program is to better understand what the sources of, what the drivers of soft costs are and how to reduce them. We focus on the role of knowledge flows, specifically spillovers, in this project. By spillovers, I mean when knowledge is generated by one firm but is gainfully utilized by some other firm. That generally is the notion of spillovers. For example, if such knowledge is used by firms to lower their costs. And so that's the focus. What I'll do today is I'll talk about project goals, our status, share with you some of our early findings, and then also share with you some potential policy and market impacts as generated by our insights. The primary question we are trying to answer is who learns what and from whom. If you look at the figure on the left, that is a depiction of the solar soft cost knowledge that exists. So that's the dark green circle. And then the arrow and the smaller circle basically represents how much of that knowledge is spilling over into the broader ecosystem. That's what exists. Our hypothesis going into this project is that what really should be and can be is more on the right side, the blue circle, which is both the knowledge that is relevant to the solar soft cost ecosystem that can be bigger. At the same time, the amount of that knowledge that can spill over and enable further cost reduction is also bigger, and that's kind of the lighter blue circle on the right. So these are the two gaps, the knowledge production gap and the knowledge acquisition gap, that we are focusing on in this project, and we are in particular interested in understanding the actors who are relevant to this knowledge ecosystem, how they're connected to each other, how they interact and learn from each other while they're producing knowledge relevant to reducing soft cost, as well as in learning knowledge that is being generated in other parts of the ecosystem. So in order to realize this potential of knowledge spillovers, we need first to understand the current breakdown of soft cost solar knowledge networks and quantify the value of spillovers and variables having the greatest impact on soft costs. And that's something that you will hear throughout this talk. We have structured this research in a multi-method data-driven approach to understand the landscape of soft costs knowledge network. The lower row here at the bottom, it shows data streams that we are developing this project. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple slides. And the upper row shows how each research task will build on existing databases or create new databases or knowledge bases with multiple open source data, using multiple open source data streams. As you can see, each research input from the bottom contributes to multiple outputs on the top. So, starting from taxonomy of soft cost all the way to processes for knowledge production acquisition, to actors who are relevant to the knowledge ecosystem, to measurement of spillover, of how much of this spillover is happening, as well as the mechanisms and the interactions through which these spillovers are happening. And the whole idea is that by combining these multi-step, multi-method approach, it will generate a holistic, integrated understanding of the solar soft cost knowledge ecosystem. The key research outputs integrate to create the following research outcomes that you see tabulated in the right-hand side. I'm not going to go through all of it, but essentially there are 4 higher-level research outcomes that come out from this project. One of them is the solar soft cost ontology. I'll talk about each one of them in more details later, but essentially we have taken a very deep and careful look at creating a systematic ontology of solar soft cost knowledge system, basically asking questions like what should be included in the knowledge domain for solar soft cost, who are the relevant actors, and what's the relationship in between them. I'll show you later on how this ontology is being used and can be used for many other things. Then second is solar soft cost knowledge map. What knowledge is created and shared and acquired in the solar networks. Who is creating this and sharing as well as acquiring through different channels? What are the perceptions around the importance of various types of solar soft costs? How they vary and how that variation impacts different intervention strategies. Then third is value of soft cost knowledge. What is the importance of different knowledge flows on soft cost reductions? Are certainly not all types of soft cost reductions are either relevant or feasible, and to the extent they're feasible, that might have geographical and market variations. So just trying to understand and quantify that. Which factors have the greatest impact? So is it knowledge? Is it the market structure? Are these policy interventions, or a combination of all of these? And then lastly, policy implications. So we are trying to do all of this with a very keen view to understand what are the policy or market levers that we can turn to further induce soft cost reduction. So in particular, looking at what policies are needed to further diffuse soft cost knowledge and best practices and so on. So I'll give you more in-depth of each of these as we move on. So in terms of the data streams, we are really using many different streams of data. Much of this we have created ourselves, but some of them we have also leveraged existing robust data sets that are available out there in public or through special partnerships that we have for this project. So at the very top is the archival data set. This is the unstructured data we have collected and collated through journals, websites, conferences, trade publications, and so on. Then the next two in the yellow are case studies that we have done. This is combined. These are about 18 to 20 case studies with about 75 interviews together, at least an hour long, perhaps longer. And there are 2 types of case studies. One is installer case studies. So these are actual installers, small, medium, or large. And then complementary firm case studies. So these are actors in the ecosystem who engage with the installers in their activities. So, for example, distributors or software providers, as well as industry groups. Then fourth stream is we have done an industry survey of installers. This was a national survey, and we had 50 responses back. We are also using Tracking the Sun data set, which is through our partnership with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. We have that data set is from 2000 to 2015, has over 500,000 data points of detailed metrics about each system that is installed in the database. Roughly represents about 70% of the so systems installed in the US. Then we have created a balance of system pattern database. It's a new data set that we have created to look at the innovation that is happening, but then how that innovation combines and interacts with the experience of the installers in helping explain variations in soft cost as experienced by the installers. And then combining many of these different data sets, we have also a network data set that gets at the connection of all these different actors in the ecosystem, which really leads us to an ongoing work on network analysis that helps us understand how a combination of all these interactions and connections eventually bears on cost reduction strategies and effectiveness. I will not share with you any results from the network analysis. That is something that is ongoing. But most of the other items, you will get a glimpse of where we are and what we are learning from that as we enter our third year. So, getting into the ontology. So, soft costs are most frequently defined by what they aren't, which is they are not hardware costs. But that really doesn't tell us a lot about what they are. And that was the primary motivation for us to build the soft cost ontology, along with the observation that every paper and project seemed to use a different set of cost categories that added to a challenge of comparing the analysis. As we got into this project, it was really hard to compare across the different studies because people were using different language, so to speak, when they're describing soft costs and then offering strategies to reduce them. So we went into a deep dive of doing a very comprehensive integration of all of this by coming up with this ontology. So we started by identifying the taxonomy of soft costs, and what we are showing here are the primary soft costs identified through the academic literature. So we looked at over 200 papers, and then we came up with about 136 classes and concepts, as well as 35 properties and relationships across these different classes. What you're seeing here, these blue circles, are the higher level primary classes that we identified through our ontology search by looking at these 200 published pieces. But then each of these breaks down into additional subcategories or subclasses in this lingo, so to speak. We identified about 88 soft costs organized hierarchically, right? So as you'll see on the next slide, each of them really blows up into much more nuanced subclasses. We also went beyond a taxonomy of soft cost and extended the work to an ontology, which really means it's not just what these categories are, but also how they are interconnected through relationships. So we also identified those relationships, and we created a more complete knowledge domain, and that's what transfers or enables moving beyond a taxonomy into an ontology. We have used the corpus of the academic literature to codify an extensive knowledge domain of solar soft costs, and we have named this the solar soft cost ontology. That includes 136 classes and 75 relationships. We have codified this ontology using the OWL language and the Prodigy development environment. These are all open source, and the ontology is being developed as an open source resource. As soon as it's finalized, our intention is, very shortly, within the next few months, this will live in the public domain for broader use. What I'm going to show you on the next slide are just a few exemplars. There's so much detail here that just talking about the ontology can be a full presentation. In fact, we have given full presentations on the ontology. I will not go into that in depth. Rather, I'll just give you some sense of how an ontology can really be useful. In fact, how it has been useful for us. So it can be helpful to the three main stakeholders that we are targeting, so researchers, installers, as well as policymakers. There are multiple uses within each of these categories. I'll just highlight a couple. So, for example, an ontology like the one that we have developed, the SSCO, can help gap analysis of research using machine-readable format. So, for example, it enables to identify areas where where items are salient and important, yet when you look at the academic literature, you may not find, or the published literature, you may not find enough insightful, in-depth studies. So, that can point to new directions of research. For policymakers, it can enable identification of barriers to local industry, for streamlining and updating and reporting, for benchmarking of soft costs and interventions. So, ontologies are naturally amenable to helping address some of these questions. For the industry itself, I think there are multiple uses, and some of these we are actively pursuing through specialized relationship with some installers or other partners on ground. So, for example, a common vocabulary the SSCO can act as a common vocabulary and translation layer for software solutions, leveraging machine-readable documentation. So given that there is so much variation in the vocabulary, that's all admissible so long as all of those variations tap into this common pool language, which then translates those variations into something standardized and machine readable. Right then, similarly, I think this is a really very low hanging but potentially very useful use of the SSCO, which is data tracking for in-house analytics by linking accounting data from processes with soft costs. So essentially, firms can use the ontology to very systematically code and track their own costs and see how their different strategies are enabling over time reductions in those different categories. But essentially, it's the richness and completeness of the ontology that gives it the power. Yet it is flexible enough and can be aggregated or abstracted at any level. So if a firm does not collect, more likely than not, perhaps no firm collects data so systematically across 135 subclasses that we have, but that's okay. It can be abstracted to any level that is relevant for that firm. So these are just some exemplars of the uses of ontology. There are many other uses that get into more of the research side of things, of how an ontology helps us collect better data and so on, that we actually have made active use of in this project, but I'm not going to go into details of that now. We can take that up in Q&A if that is more of interest. So getting more into mapping of the soft cost knowledge, which involves understanding the importance of various soft costs, the actors who create and share, as well as acquire knowledge about soft costs. And the next few slides are more informed by the case studies, as well as the survey of the installers that we have done. And what you're seeing here are the soft costs which were identified as being salient to installers. And this is, as I said, a combination of what we're learning from installers and the case studies, the case studies and the survey. And some of this is, certainly not surprising, certainly not new. But then there are a few things which are very interesting as we'll dig deeper into the next few slides. So these are the cost categories identified by everybody, but not necessarily the most important ones, just the more common ones. So, of course, overhead, acquisition, permitting, system design, installation processes, and then, maintenance and education, customer education were also identified by the installers. What is interesting here, and that's the reason it's in italics here, is none of the published literature actually identifies maintenance or customer education as a cost that the installers have to bear. But the installers certainly see that directly as a soft cost for them. In terms of what was identified as high impact soft costs, so organizational overhead, but there is a lot of variation in terms of the overhead that the firms face. So we'll get into more details in the next slide. Also utilities and regulation. So the cost of conducting the studies, getting the permits, but then also costs associated with utility delays in permitting. And then finally customer acquisition. In particular customer education, given how rapidly some of the technologies or combination of technologies as well as product offerings may be changing. So for example, solar, but now with storage and electric vehicles and so on, it becomes complex pretty rapidly, and customers need to be updated on an ongoing basis. And this is an onus that falls in significant part, certainly not entirely, but in significant part on the installers themselves. In terms of the overhead, so what we're finding here is that there is a lot of variation in both how the installers see what overhead entails, but then also what they're incurring in terms of different types of overhead costs. So in terms of customer acquisition, these could be lead generators, could be in-house, could be through referrals and other mechanisms. In terms of obtaining obtaining a contract, and when the contract is obtained, some firms do all the design up front and have a higher closing rate, for example, almost as high as 30%, and a lower number of change orders, but then more wasted effort on design when customers actually don't sign. As against, some do only preliminary estimate and design after contract, but then only have about 10% closing rate. So you're seeing a lot of variation in terms of contracting practices by these firms. Based on our complementary case studies, so these are the firms that support the solar industry, for example, the distributors and the software providers. This high level of variation in terms of overhead makes it difficult to offer off-the-shelf software solutions. And this is one of the very interesting, insightful findings we have from the project at this point. Many large to mid-sized firms develop their own software, building modules on top of commercial products such as Salesforce. On software design, let's say roughly the top 20 firms have about 70% of sales volume, and they tend to keep their software in-house. So these are the installers. This generally reduces the potential size of the market for the software firms. The variation then in terms of business practices, along with fragmentation of the market, what that means is it becomes challenging for the software providers to scale a customer base that can support off-the-shelf software solutions. And add to that the challenge that there's lack of standardization in the data that the installers are actually able to provide to them as an input for product development. Why is all of this important? Because software has the potential to reduce costs through more streamlined practices and processes, and yet what we're observing is this lack of standardization, both in terms of in the firm business practices, but also data availability. That's really being a significant barrier for software providers to provide effective standardized software solutions. Moving on to PII, utilities and regulators and regulations have also been listed, and not surprisingly, as a primary soft cost. What you're seeing here is data that we collected through our survey of installers on the labor hours required on different activities as part of the permitting process. Combined, what you're seeing is a mean of overall activities of about 25 hours. In particular, if you look preparing for the permit, there's a lot of, it has the largest variation in terms of the labor hour required, and it also has, its average is the highest. So certainly firms are experiencing a lot of effort that goes in, but then also there's a lot of variation, and especially becomes challenging if firms are operating in different multiple markets at the same time. What we also find is there is a lot of variation, but then also a significant amount in terms of approval time. So combined together in terms of the approval process, combined together, what we're finding in our sample is an average delay of about 47 days. And it becomes important because this approval time is larger than the 30 days, which typically is referred to as the net 30, which is what typically the payment grace period is. So it becomes especially challenging for smaller firms if they are operating in markets that experience higher delay times. So streamlining PIA processes and reducing approval times is critical. Again, this is not something new. This has been known before, but what we are offering here is some new data, but then also how that experience in terms of overhead for permitting varies by different actors and size of actors in the system. We are still working through this data to understand how knowledge spillovers may impact these values, as well as quantifying how these time delays may be contributing to soft costs. So we're building some models where we're looking at, depending on who a particular installer is interacting with or partnering with and what type of knowledge interactions they have in the broader ecosystem, does that give a particular advantage in terms of them being more effective in reducing their permitting-related overhead. So those are the types of models we are still in the process of building. Moving on to customer acquisition. While customer acquisition strategy varies across firms, many firms recognize the importance of customer education. This is something I referred to before, something that has not been paid much attention to, but has become actually quite salient and quite a part of an operation for the installers. Because of the complexity of the technology, a lot of the time is spent in upfront in terms of educating the customer. Especially as sophistication of the technology has increased, there is a lot of need for customer education. This aspect, even though we are not going to get in details, is an interesting midpoint between supply side aspects as well as demand side, so customer behavior as well as barriers to adoption, and the role of information and education in the whole process. And we have some other complementary work going on in this area that we can share with you during Q&A. We also know that based on the survey results, majority of the firms rely on referrals as one of the lowest cost customer acquisition strategies. However, what we also learn is that this may be a double-edged sword. It appears that this approach imposes a constraint on growth rate, in that informants also noted that as their firms grow, responding to referrals in a timely manner stretches the capacity of the project managers and sales reps, leading to a decrease in service quality, leading to a decrease in the referral rate. This is especially true during busy business cycles when referrals also are higher, so it is harder to deal with them, and then given that the firms already are in heavy activity mode. So it's part of what we have collected in terms of the data are all these different strategies being used by the firms, and we are learning some higher level insights, but over the next remaining duration of the project, we are digging deeper into how some of these strategies are further actually impacting cost reductions. So moving on now, what you're seeing on this slide is the different types of knowledge, but then also the different channels that firms, that the different installers are using to gather those types of knowledge. So the blue boxes here represent the different types of knowledge, and then the circles are the different channels or actors. I'll just point out quickly that some of the sources, so the circles, some of them are actors or people. So for example, employee mobility, whereas some of the other circles are venues. So for example, trade shows. And let me just also, before I get into what we really are seeing here, clarify a few things here. By best business practices, we are referring to higher level company strategy that is influenced at the management level. Whereas we also have business process improvements, which are more idiosyncratic day-to-day practices, like installation techniques. Logistical expertise may include managing supply chain logistics, which is more relevant when we are talking about suppliers and distributors, or construction site management when we are talking about employee mobility. So, the same type of knowledge may have different bearings upon the actor or the learning process that we are talking about. In general, smaller installers tend to depend a lot more on distributors for logistical expertise. So let me highlight a few things here that is important to note here. When it comes to embodied codified knowledge, so for example, technology or technical processes, installers are accessing those types of knowledge more from trade shows or suppliers and distributors. When it comes to softer, tacit, more human-related knowledge aspects, then installers are accessing that through different mechanisms. So, for example, employee mobility. So, hiring staff strategically. This is particularly relevant at higher levels of management. But then also, learning about administrative processes or about software improvements from their peers by being part of specialized groups that come together to share with each other, and these are more effective when the installers that are part of that group are in non-competitive, operating in different parts of the market in a non-competitive way. So what we're seeing, the key thing to note here is that the knowledge that is relevant, there is a lot of variation in terms of what is the knowledge, right? So and depending on what type of knowledge it is, there are different sources or learning processes that are relevant and are being leveraged by the installers. At the same time, as we dig deeper, there is also an implication for how some of these mechanisms may be leveraged by larger versus smaller firms. So, for example, if you look at experimentation, here some installers do experimentation to get more technical expertise as well as try out some business process improvements and see if they are being effective, also to improve their best business practices. Yet it is more conducive to do that type of experimentation, especially at some scale, so that there is systematic learning only for some of the larger firms, right? And so, that may be a systematic barrier for some of the other installers who do not have that scale to engage in some of these learning activities. And so, essentially, you have a landscape where only some of these mechanisms are accessible by some of the installers, and so they may be learning in some cases and not in some of the other cases. So that's where we are headed in terms of resolving this even further and seeing the implications for across geography as well as by size of the installers for these mechanisms. So now that I've shared with you a little bit, what we're doing in terms of the ontology and mapping of the soft cost as well as the relevant actors and how they are interacting and learning from each other, let's take a look at quantifying the impact of knowledge spillovers in terms of reducing soft costs. And what you're seeing here is a map of installer experience, so average number of installations by county spread across the US. So that's on the left-hand side, so it's the heat map. On the right side, you're seeing total number of patents and patent applications across about 15 years or so, patenting activity by state. And what you see is, so if you look at California, it's heavily dense installer experience as well as lots of patents coming out of, and these are balance of system patents. So this is the new unique data set that we have collected by going through the USPTO data. And we are seeing a lot of overlap in terms of both the experience as well as patenting activity, and essentially this means it becomes harder to tease out whether it is the innovation that is through the patents or is it the experience that is happening at the installer level. So is it the learning by doing process, or is it the innovation or the learning by searching process, which is potentially leading to soft cost reductions. And so to deal with this issue of overlapping drivers, we build models where we bring in all of these relevant market as well as policy factors, as well as system factors and firm level characteristics all into the same model. And then we model the soft price, which essentially is the system price minus the hardware price. So we model the soft price as a function of these characteristics of the firm, characteristics of the competition policy, as well as system characteristics, and then see which of these different factors actually are driving soft prices. So our first pricing model models soft price as a function of installer experience. both local and non-local, as well as internal and external. And as I said, it includes characteristics of the installers, the PV system, market policy, as well as the location. I'm not showing you the model specification here, but I do have that in the backup. So if it comes up in Q&A, I can show you in more details. But what we're finding is that learning effects. So essentially, how firms are learning from their own experience or learning from the experience of other installers. So that's what learning effects is referring to, collectively contribute to about 42% of soft cost reductions for the period for our model. So roughly from 2007 to 2015. But spillover effects are higher at higher levels of experience, right? So what we're observing is an increasing returns, which indicates that price reduction due to learning only accrues at higher levels of experience, making knowledge spillovers relevant depending on the market size. And this has an important policy implication that I'll get into in a couple slides from here. Let me also note at this point that some of the other model variables that we are observing as having a high impact on soft cost reduction, certainly the system size. So larger the system size, it has a pretty significant impact on the soft price itself, not just the hardware price, but also the soft price. As well as this policy variable, which we refer to here as value of solar, but it is a composite policy variable that includes multiple different policy aspects into one variable. And what we're observing is that policy factors are also contributing to about 22% of the soft cost reduction for the data set that we have, which is, as I mentioned, a very, very large data set of about 500,000 installed systems, residential systems in the US. So in our models, learning effects reduce soft cost by up to $2 a watt, which is very, very significant. And we have broken the learning effect by both, as I mentioned, both geography, so local versus non-local, so your own market versus the non-local market, as well as learning within the firm versus learning that is happening outside of the firm. And we find that the learning from local competitors has the highest effect. The second highest effect is non-local peers. So this is vertical learning that is happening within the firm, but learning based off of installation that has happened outside of the specific market. And then the weakest but still significant impact is from what is strictly known as learning by doing, which is experience within the firm in that specific market. So these are either counties or zip codes. That's what you can think of as the localized market. And so the LBD, conventional LBD, is having the weakest effect. But combined, as I mentioned, combined together, the learning effect is very, very significant on soft costs. About over 40% of the soft cost reductions are explained by a combination of these three different mechanisms. One implication of this result is that policies that subsidize demand for PV are leading to the creation of new knowledge that would not exist at lower levels of demand, right? So, higher the demand, larger the soft cost reduction, and certainly what is happening in between is new knowledge that was being created is being used for nonlinear reductions in soft prices. And further, the fact that we find that spillovers become stronger at higher levels of experience suggests that these subsidies need to be substantial, particularly in new markets with many small firms. And essentially because in new markets, the market is small, so you don't have that experience or knowledge base which sets up these nonlinear learning processes. And at the same time, if you have many small firms, that experience is spread among those firms, again, not enabling this entry beyond a certain, if you will, a certain threshold of, how these knowledge mechanisms play into in a nonlinear way for further cost reductions. So that's coming off of the models that we have built. Where we are headed next in terms of the modeling is further separating the learning by doing effect into three pieces. I mentioned to you the patents work. So we are trying to bring that into the model and see how patenting is impacting reduction in soft costs, as well as we're bringing in creating variables, network variables. So looking at installer and supplier, so both inverter manufacturers as well as panel manufacturer, looking at those networks and creating variables of those interactions, bringing them into the model and seeing how a combination of learning by doing so experience, learning by interacting, so essentially the network of interactions, as well as learning by searching, so patenting activity combined together are further reducing soft costs. So going a little bit further and deeper to have an even more comprehensive and complete set of independent variables for our models. So that's work in progress. And so if I'm giving another webinar in a few months, we'll have an update on that. So the last two slides are essentially a summary of some of the key things that we're finding and some early policy as well as market implications. So as I mentioned, standard definitions of soft costs are very critical in terms for facilitating identification of research, discussion, and reduction of soft costs. Overhead is consistently being identified as being important, yet it's highly variable for a variety of reasons, and that variance is causing a big barrier for development of processes and products and services that can systematically reduce soft costs. Utility and regulation, so those costs they continue to be high as well as variable, and in particular, approval times are long and out of sync with finance options, especially for smaller firms. And this is one of those very interesting nuanced findings that we have is also the role of distributors, which is very much both evolving but being critical in many ways in terms of as aggregators as well as diffusers of knowledge, as well as creation of different support mechanisms for the installers, for example through financing options, but the role of distributors is actually very much underestimated as well as understudied, and this is one of the areas which we think is both interesting, ripe, as well as important in really getting a better understanding of the soft cost knowledge ecosystem, but then also using as a lever this distributor network for further soft cost reductions. Knowledge spillovers, we find have significant potential to reduce soft costs. There are significant geographical differences in the value of solar. As I mentioned, learning from local competitors provide the greatest soft cost reduction. So, that's essentially local demand, and the size of that demand is very, very important in terms of how much more soft cost reductions can be achieved. Just a few high-level implications. I mentioned already the role of distributors and how they are emerging as a very, very important set of actors in this ecosystem. So, focusing more on them and using them as levers. So, for example, more and more distributors are recognizing their role of providing knowledge to the installers as a way of actually nurturing those relationships as well as keeping their customers, but then what levers may be used to further have the distributors organized as well as even participate in a more systematic way in nascent markets or markets where smaller installers are playing. Then we also see lots of variation in business practices, which are acting as barriers for software providers, and so trying to identify opportunities to standardize business practices to the extent possible, and this gets into a different type of customer education, and in this case the customer is the installer, as to, so not all practices can be standardized, but there we believe lots of opportunities here to standardize business practices, which can reduce overhead internally at the firm, but then also enable broader development of services in the market that can further reduce costs. And then finally, spillovers support the need for subsidies to engender soft cost reductions, particularly for nascent markets. So again, goes back to size of that local demand being very relevant for soft cost reductions. And in terms of next steps, we are building the network models to bring all of these pieces together and understand things in a more holistic way. We continue to refine our pricing models, where we're bringing in, as I suggested, the network variables as well as innovation variables. And then finally, integrating the findings across these multiple research outputs to come up with our final recommendations. So this project is slated to end of this year, and by that time, we'll have multiple data sets, the Ontology software tool, as well as multiple papers, building off of much of what I shared on an early version of today. So that's all I have to say, and we can take some questions.
Great, thank you so much. So if anyone has any questions, you're either able to turn on your microphone and you can ask through that, or please feel free to type them into the chat window, and Varun can answer them for you. Okay. Well, we'll wait just another minute if anyone has any other questions. But otherwise, thank you so much to Dr. Varun Rai for giving us this update on the project, and we'll look forward to hearing more. I see there is. Yep, here's one question for you.
So the question is, this is from Jim McMahon. Does competition among firms limit knowledge sharing? This is a classic question. In general, depends on the nature of the competition, right? So, for example, if firms are competing for the same market segment in a very, very overlapping market, yes, it certainly limits knowledge sharing. As against, even if firms are in the residential market trying to sell very similar products, but they're in different geographies, just given what their businesses are, they can come together and share a lot of knowledge. And this is something that we actually observe in some of our case studies, where you have groups of installers coming together from different parts of the country. They're non-competing, they're not competing with each other, and that enables these groups to share with each other business best practices, administrative practices, as well as other resources with each other. So it really depends on what really that competition is. So the answer is a mixed one here. The other way to cut this question is, given that in general, yes, I know installers in overlapping markets and customer segments will not be as amenable to sharing knowledge with each other, and that's also the reason why, for example, they're leveraging hiring and employee mobility to learn what they cannot learn directly, or doing experimentation to learn what they cannot learn directly by observing, or just talking to other installers. So the question on examples or case studies of distributors as conveyor of knowledge. So we do have examples, but I'm not able to share with you the name. All of our case studies are anonymous, but certainly there are distributors. So I'll say this: even within distributors, there's certainly variation in terms of how much either they are able to do or act as knowledge conveyors, or how much able they are to do that. But some of them certainly have recognized knowledge as being very, very critical to their offering. And by offering, this is the service or set of products that they offer to the installers. And some of the distributors have come to the conclusion that building knowledge and understanding of the broader supply chain, as well as management of finances for the installers themselves, has become an integral part of some of these distributors. So this is still, in terms, the distributor part of the story is actually just playing out. It's evolving more, but knowledge is becoming, as we are observing, certainly more and more central to that story.
You might have one more. It looks like that Scott maybe is typing another question or comment, but if anyone else has anything they'd like to ask, please feel free.
Yeah, so Scott's question is, subsidies support too many not with knowledge, so it underwrites learning and customer experience, and then how do subsidies eventually get phased out? You are already seeing subsidies having been phased out in many parts of the, in many of the markets. So, for example, certainly in some of the bigger markets, California, for example, all the local state incentives are long gone. Basically, for the last several years, they have been out, and it's certainly a question in terms of something that we are dealing front and center here is what is that tipping point. One thing that we do observe is in this aspect of spillovers is something that is not just inherent or limited to within a firm. So it is what is known as an externality. So spillovers inherently are externalities, and whenever you have something like that is a fair and square role for policies, and subsidies are an example of that, to internalize those types of externalities, right? So there certainly is need for it, and what our work is suggesting is that there is need for a certain level of scale to enable those types of knowledge production that leads to the spillover, leading to cost reductions. So there's this cycle, virtuous cycle, if you will, that gets set off at some scale, right? And you can totally imagine, we don't know that at this point, that that scale or level of experience or demand might itself vary by geography, but there is something at some level until which point you do need to support the demand so that the relevant knowledge or experience is generated, not just for the installers, but for the broader ecosystem. So the spillovers or learning is actually, I would say, is a catch-all phrase, because not all the experience that exists in the ecosystem and the past experience of all the installers is spilling over equally to all the different installers. So it's variable, but that experience collectively is impacting operations within the broader ecosystem. So even how the permitting process works, even how the supply processes work, and so on. So there is a broader collective ecosystem level experience and knowledge generation that is happening that impacts everybody else, right? And so I think that's the key point with subsidies. You need to support that up until some point, and yes, and beyond that point, it's very, very important to phase subsidies out.
Okay. Well, maybe we've got one. All right, now. Just a couple folks saying thanks to Varun, and yes, we'll pass along our thanks as well. Thank you for your time and for giving us an update on the project. And if you're interested in a few more months, and once you finalize the study, let us know. We'll be happy to have you back. Thanks to everyone else who tuned in, and we have another speaker in 2 weeks from now. So keep an eye out on our page, and there'll be more information on that. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.